everyone, welcome back to English 116. This is for our class for Wednesday, the 13th of September. So what I wanted to do was to continue our introduction about literature and film and then begin to transition into our first film of the semester, and that happens to be Citizen Kane. Before I do that, last class, as you know, I talked a little bit about plagiarism and artificial intelligence. I believe I had referenced an attorney who used artificial intelligence in a legal brief, and it turns out that the information that he was given by artificial intelligence was incorrect. And if you want it, and now he's facing some rather significant consequences professionally because of that. But if you wanted to learn more about that particular story, I thought I would include the link, and you can see that below the video. I'll always be including my notes below each video to reinforce what it is that I'm discussing. You'll also notice that I attached a picture, and I think this picture really illustrates the importance of watching film carefully. You may or may not recognize the film that this picture is depicting. It happens to be Stanley Kubrick's The Shining, and the first picture we have is of our central character, played by Jack Nicholson, and he is wearing a green tie, which would seem to be a completely unimportant detail. But Kubrick was a master in terms of what he was doing. Take a look at the close-up of the tie, and you can see that it looks like a green maze. And you can see that the following two pictures are of the central character. His name is Jack Torrance. First looking at a model of a green maze, and then we've got the close-up of the maze. The maze is going to be a very important element in the story. In other words, Kubrick was very deliberate about choosing that particular tie to foreshadow or to give us a hint or clue of what would be important and what would be occurring later on within the story. So ideally, when you're reading a text or watching a film, you've done it or you do it 3 times. The first, just to absorb the story. The second, to look for details, such as this tie. And then the third, just to remind yourself. So in terms of what we're doing, and I know that sometimes you don't have necessarily the opportunity to do 3 times, and sometimes you might be hard-pressed just to do 1. But each time you review a film and each time you read a text, you're able to get more information from it. In fact, when it comes to Citizen Kane, we will be watching that film, our first film, twice. First, we will watch it as a film, and secondly, we will watch it with the very famous film critic, you might have heard of him before, Roger Ebert, giving his commentary, scene by scene, of that particular film, just so that you can get an idea of the importance of that film and why it's considered so central in film studies. But before I start talking about Citizen Kane, I wanted to talk about some of the readings that I had assigned. For instance, writing about fiction. And this is on pages 46 through 65 if you're using the 11th edition. I draw your attention specifically to page 47, though you might be using a different edition, and that would mean that it's a different page. But there are lists of questions for you to ask yourself when you're reading, when you're writing, even when you're watching film. And I don't expect you to go through the list and just check off each question, but keep these in the back of your mind. This is a great thing to dog ear, where you're asked about things like conflict. Every story has to have some sort of conflict or tension. Who's the protagonist? Who's the main character? Who's supposed to be the hero? Doesn't even have to be a person. It could be something like an external force, like the weather. Who is the antagonist? And that too can be an external force, like the weather. The antagonist would be the enemy. Is the story told chronologically? And if not, why? It's probably important. How is the exposition or the background information revealed? So notice we're getting some terms here. And thinking about things like, for instance, what is your response, and does your response change to the characters over the course of the story? Are the characters very stereotypical, So are they flat characters because they have just one or two qualities, or are they stock or stereotypical characters, or are they known as round characters? Do they have more depth and dimension to them? How does the author reveal characters? Who are the minor characters? Why are they there? Setting. Why is it that that story is set in a particular locale? Could the setting be used symbolically, that it represents or suggests something else? And as I had suggested earlier, maybe the setting is a kind of antagonist or an enemy. For instance, fighting against the elements, a harsh winter, for instance. Who's telling the story? And how would the story change if you're getting it from a different perspective? And these are skills we use in everyday life. When somebody tells us something, we don't evaluate just what they're saying. We evaluate who is saying it. That helps us make judgments about how much we can trust or not trust that information. Do we think that the narrator or the storyteller is reliable and objective? Why or why not? Does the author ever directly comment on the action? And as we talked about things like symbolism, representational things that go beyond the literal, where could we see something like that in a text or a film? The theme, or themes, I think is much more accurate. What are the major truths? What are the overall statements or the social commentaries that are being made in the film or in the text? And is that theme directly stated? And I can just about guarantee that in most complex texts and films, it's not. It's something that you have to interpret. What kind of language is being used? And is that language appropriate for the characters that are being depicted? Or, as I oftentimes say, is the text or the film worth reading or watching more than once? That really is my definition of something that has literary greatness, is that it ultimately brings forth new meaning with each rereading or with each viewing. Something like Citizen Kane. And even Roger Ebert will admit in his analysis of Citizen Kane that he's seen the film dozens, if not more times. And every time he sees it, he sees something new. And asking about critical strategies, is this something that you want to think about when you are watching a film or reading a film? That there are certain lenses in which you can watch a film from. If you are interested in biography, how does the biographical information about the filmmaker or the author help you understand? If you're interested in history, how does the history of the text or the film help you understand that film? And actually, we're going to talk a little bit about the history of Citizen Kane in a few moments, as well as some information about biography. What kind of evidence from the story are you focusing on? How do your own experiences, beliefs, and values inform your interpretation? We all have bias. You can never eliminate bias, but you want to try to be aware of it. And there are lots of different ways you can go about interpreting, considering that there are many different lenses through which you could view something or read something. Which is the lens that you are going to be utilizing and why? On page 50, actually, you're given a sample paper in progress. We'll talk a little bit more about writing papers as the semester progresses, but it talks about the process of first generating ideas, which is the process that most people skip. They try to write immediately, and you're usually making the exercise much more difficult for yourself. Generate ideas. Don't worry about whether they're good or bad. Don't worry about if things are spelled correctly or expressed grammatically correctly. What you just want to do is to jot down some thoughts that, of course, you can change and eliminate and add to. That's the drafting process. And then finally, you can go through the editing process where you're trying to make it more polished, something that could be handed in. As I had indicated, we'll talk a little bit more about writing papers. And in fact, I've changed a few of the writing assignments in class that I've done in the past, in part because of artificial intelligence. And I'll talk a little bit more why when we get to that point. The textbook, I had also assigned a section on the reading and the writing process, about how you want to read and then discuss, and that ultimately that helps you with your writing. And it's the same with watching film. You want to watch, discuss, and then ultimately write about it. And as you are taking notes, that's known as annotating. You can take notes in a text if you're reading a text. One of those reasons why that we have those big white margins and so many texts, so that you can write notes in them. But if you're not comfortable with writing in a text, you can always write on a separate sheet of paper or write on a screen. And in fact, your note taking can take the form of journaling, which is much like writing a diary, but rather than writing a diary about your personal life, you're writing a diary about your responses to what it is that you're reading, your reflections, your reactions. And in fact, you're given examples of note taking on page 1666, and also examples of writing journals on the same page in the 11th edition. But these are merely examples. Everybody takes notes differently. Everybody takes journals different, or writes journals differently if you decide to write journals. Certainly, if you're reading a text, I encourage you to take notes. Certainly, if you're watching a film from an academic perspective, I encourage you to take notes. And on page 1678 of the text, it talks a little bit about papers, that you need to have a general sense of a topic, which I'm going to be sharing with you some possible topics soon. And then a thesis, a specific position about that topic. And then you need to have evidence in order to be able to support that particular position. The evidence comes from the text, whether it's written text or perhaps it's dialogue or it's explanation from the film itself. And then you get to organize and draft your arguments. You definitely need to use quotation, whether it be quotation from the text that you're reading or quotation from the film if you're doing that kind of in-depth analysis. And for the quotation from the text, we usually refer to its page number, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. For quotation for film, we usually talk about its timestamp. We'll talk a little bit more about that. And then finally, the revision and the editing stage, the stage most people skip because frankly, they've run out of time and energy. So you want to start early enough. And I had indicated that your first formal writing assignment, I had assigned it for midway through the semester, but I've basically got a rolling due date on it during the first part of the semester. My hope is that by the midpoint of the semester, you would have handed in that first paper. Hence, we'll be talking about that first paper sooner rather than later. On page 1678 of the text, that might be another page you might want to highlight and dog ear so you can refer back to it. It talks about the writing process, something that I suspect you probably discussed in English 101 or Composition 1, but I'll also discuss it as well as part of review. And as you know, I'm oftentimes supplementing what's in the textbook with handouts. In this instance, it's about specifically writing about film, which is a slightly different exercise than writing about text. For instance, if you're writing about a film and you're using a quote, you would use a timestamp. And it talks about how watching a film from an academic perspective requires just as much thought and energy as reading a text. And there's lots of different writing assignments. Maybe the most popular form in writing about film is the movie review. You've probably read those in the media. Those are usually less academic, and they're more geared towards general audiences. The critical essay, that's what usually we do in the academic arena, whether we're writing about a written text or in this instance, if it turns out that we're writing about film. We're talking about key details and themes, not necessarily going into lengthy summaries. And you'll see that in the notes below, I've included the web link for this handout about writing about film. That's in the third section. And you can also find a PDF of it in our syllabus and other documents folder. I always suggest that you take a print copy. I'm working with a print copy, but it's your choice. And that ultimately you might want to focus on the formal elements of a work, things like the structure and the style, whether you do that with text or you do that with film. So what's interesting and significant about things like a scene or the lighting or the sound or the editing or the cinematography, those are specific elements that are associated with film that you wouldn't necessarily consider in a written text. And how does that impact the meaning of the film? Or perhaps you want to look at a particular genre or kind of writing or kind of film. Films are usually categorized in genres. Go on Netflix and you'll see that we've got comedies and we've got things like sci-fi and we've got things like horror. They follow predictable elements. But A good film also engages in a certain level of creativity, even though it follows elements, much like Shakespeare was able to follow certain criteria in his dramas. Comedies had certain elements, and histories had certain elements, and tragedies had certain elements, yet there was also a certain level of creativity to them. So, beginning to look for patterns, whether you're reading a text or especially if you're viewing a film, patterns with things like lighting, editing, cinematography, mise en scene. And in fact, this is something Roger Ebert is going to talk about in much greater detail when it comes to Citizen Kane. And content, things like the plot, the narration, the characterization, the themes. Thinking about the history of the film. Again, this is something that I'll talk about, or we'll soon talk about, when we discuss Citizen Kane. Asking yourself certain questions like what common structures or themes or techniques are associated with a particular genre. When did this genre first appear and why? Does it conform to expectations? Why or why not? Thinking about, again, the history associated with the text or the film. How does the film show the unique historical moment of the time? And of course, the film might be depicting contemporary times, but the film might be set in the past or in the future. And that's also the same when we're reading a text. How does historical background of the time help you understand the narrative? And comparing a subject matter of certain films to their unique historical movements. For instance, film noir is known as a very dark kind of film that oftentimes uses shadow and mystery. Or documenting the reception of a film by a particular audience and how has that changed over time, if it's changed over time. The theoretical essay is usually a more complex essay. It usually requires a certain understanding of film history, film theory, or film techniques. Keep in mind we're an introductory class, so we're not necessarily going to be focusing on theoretical essays. But for those of you who wanted to study film in greater depth in the future, talking about what distinguishes, let's say, foreign films from American films, or different cultural perspectives in viewing a film, or looking at how certain directors proceed with their own films. And they mention a very famous director in this handout, Alfred Hitchcock. I had mentioned a very famous director at the start of this class, Stanley Kubrick. They all have their own kinds of styles and techniques. Or even ideology. What politics or underlying messages are portrayed in the film or in the text. Classic Hollywood, and this is what we're going to be talking about with Citizen Kane, how classic film formulas dominate. But of course, you can view film from a feminist perspective, just like you can read text from a feminist perspective. How are women portrayed? You can view it from a cultural perspective. How is culture portrayed? You could view it from a racial perspective. How are races portrayed? From a class perspective, how are different classes and economic arrangements portrayed? From queer theory, and that's become quite popular in the last couple decades or so, about how gender relationships can be challenged or even disrupted in a particular text or in a particular film. So I just give this to you about how to read a film and something for you to contemplate, as well as how to write about a film, for something for you to contemplate. But notice that we're using many of the same techniques with film that we would use with literature, even though, of course, the venues are quite different. Written text is very different from motion picture, as we had talked about. So that leads us to talking about the film that we will be viewing in this section. This is our fiction section, so we will be reading some short stories eventually. I wish we had time for novel. We don't have time for novel, unfortunately. But short story, I think, is a good way to be introduced to the idea of fiction. And when it came to film, if we're going to be doing film studies, there's usually one film that bubbles to the top, and that happens to be Citizen Kane. It's important for a whole host of reasons, historical being one of them. In fact, it oftentimes appears on the best of lists in terms of cinema. And I think I might have shared with you that I was first exposed to this film when I was a freshman in college, in an English class, no less. And I honestly didn't think much of the film at the time because I really didn't understand the film. It was only years later when I began to understand what was being done in the film and why that I've realized its brilliance. And it really is in my top type 5 films. In fact, maybe in my top 3 films, because every time I see this film, I always find something new and I'm always so impressed. And yes, part of it has to do with the time period. Citizen Kane helped to establish many of the techniques, the cinematography, and just the motion picture techniques that we take for granted in contemporary film. So that's part of it. But there was a wonderful documentary that came out that talked a little bit about the Battle of Citizen Kane, because Citizen Kane has a lot of controversy associated with it. And I think knowing about that controversy just helps you understand a little bit more about the film itself, which we will be viewing next class. But at this point, you can see in the notes below that I've included some sections from that documentary, not all of them, approximately 40 minutes of sections in total. Talking a little bit about what the film industry was like in the late 30s and the early 40s. Talking a little bit about a media Mongol. His name was William Randolph Hearst. And he had incredible political power. He owned all kinds of newspapers and all kinds of media venues. If you are familiar with Rupert Murdoch in our contemporary times, it was somewhat similar. This is important because Citizen Kane is supposed to be loosely based on William Randolph Hearst. But it's not so loosely based, because if you know anything at all about William Randolph Hearst and you watch Citizen Kane, it's pretty clear that Citizen Kane is about William Randolph Hearst. And he didn't take kindly to the portrayal of his life in Citizen Kane. Again, it's fiction, and it's technically not about William Randolph Hearst. It's about a fictional man named Citizen Kane. But there are way too many similarities between the two not to note the obvious connection. So there are sections about who Hearst was as a newsman, who Hearst was in New York City, how he had political ambitions, and he certainly had an incredible amount of money and power. And the political failures that he experienced, he was never able to achieve political office. So basically, he isolated himself in a place called San Simeon. All of this is going to be important because we will see that that is basically the plot of Citizen Kane. Somebody who turns out to be a media Mongol who ends up having lots of power and political ambitions and eventually fails. Hopefully that's not too much in the way of spoiler alerts. And isolates himself. Something else about William Randolph Hearst that we'll learn as we talk about Hearst is that while he was married, he was also very public about his lover. Her name was Marion Davies, and in fact, they lived together, even though he was married. And you will see something comparable, though with some fictional changes in Citizen Kane with his lover. And her name in the film is Susan Alexander. And reputedly, that was really what angered William Randolph Hearst the most. Although he wasn't pleased with his portrayal, he was not pleased with the portrayal of his lover, who was depicted in the character of Marion Davies. Again, Marion Davies, or I should say, who was depicted in the character of Susan Alexander. Susan Alexander in the film is supposed to be fictional, but it's pretty clear if you know anything about William Randolph Hearst or his lover, his mistress, Davies, that this is basically a portrayal of Hearst's lover. And I can say that the female character in Citizen Kane, his second wife, Susan Alexander, is not portrayed positively at all. Again, hopefully I'm not giving away too many spoiler alerts. You'll also learn a little bit about the director, who also was the star of Citizen Kane, and that happens to be Orson Welles, very famous. You may have heard of him before. He was known for radio broadcasting prior to this. In fact, a very famous radio broadcast that I talk about in my introduction to media studies class, The War of the Wells, or The War of the Worlds by H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells is a science fiction author, no way connected with Orson Welles. But Orson Welles took this fictional science fiction story of Martians invading the United States, dramatized it in a radio play, had it occur, this dramatization in real time through a series of news reports. And individuals who tuned in late, and many did because there was a very popular radio program on ahead of time, and Orson Welles was quite aware of this, that he would get lots of viewers tuning in late, would miss the disclaimer that the story was fictional, and it sounded realistic enough so that many people thought it was true. Mass panic ensued. The phone lines were jammed. There were huge traffic jams. Reputedly, even some people committed suicide because they thought that that would be the better option than being overtaken by space aliens. So it was quite the drama. And it led to a lot of changes in the FCC, if nothing else, that one has to periodically mention that something is fictional just so that this event doesn't occur again. Orson Welles had testified at hearings saying that he was completely unaware of the hysteria that was occurring. But if you watch the battle over Citizen Kane in its entirety, it talks a little bit about Orson Welles' history and how, at least according to his fellow radio players, he knew darn well what was happening, and he proceeded because he wanted to scare his audiences. This was a broadcast that was done on Halloween Eve, so part of his agenda was to give everyone a good fright. Now, one of two things could have happened. This could have ended Orson Welles' career. Instead, what happened is he was given a movie contract, and Orson Welles was very young, in his early 20s. This movie contract was unheard of for the time. And again, in the sections that I'm asking you to watch about the Battle of Citizen Kane, it'll talk a little bit about that young Orson Welles and how he was given a movie contract that basically gave him total freedom. What he ended up doing was linking up with a screenwriter. His name was Mankiewicz. And the screenwriter was good friends with Marion Davies, who happened to be the mistress of William Randolph Hearst. And Mankiewicz wrote a script that was very loosely based on Hearst's life. And Orson Welles took advantage of this and thought that the script was wonderful, and it is wonderful. And Orson Welles thought that he had enough cachet and enough power that he could actually present this, which was a very thinly filmed reference to William Randolph Hearst, one of the most powerful men in the United States, and there wouldn't be repercussions because, after all, there weren't repercussions with Orson Welles' broadcast with War of the Worlds. He miscalculated Orson Welles in this case. William Randolph Hearst made it his lifelong mission to destroy Orson Welles' career, and William Randolph Hearst made it his lifelong mission to try to destroy the film Citizen Kane. Luckily, he didn't. But I can say that it was blacked out for a while, and in fact, Orson Welles was basically ostracized from Hollywood, as you will learn by watching the film's clips below. So this gives you a little bit of the context of some of the history of Citizen Kane, which I think is going to be particularly interesting and also useful when we watch the film. The film is a piece of cinema magic, and Roger Ebert will talk about it, but the film is also very important politically and from a historical perspective in terms of cinema, and also two great men, Orson Welles and also William Randolph Hearst. And I think that we'll see how all of that plays a role in the importance of Citizen Kane. So what I'm going to ask you to do now is to watch about those 40 minutes of clips or so. Again, you can find them below. YouTube is a wonderful thing. And that's going to be today's attendance question, actually, for our class discussion forum. And as you know, you're not required to respond to your peers, but you are required to read your peers' responses and also my responses in turn. So I will be addressing your first responses, or I should say, your most your most recent responses to the discussion forum shortly. But this question is about the documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane, which I acknowledge you're not seeing in its entirety. I picked and chose those clips that I thought might be most applicable for getting ready to view Orson Welles' Citizen Kane. But based on those 40 minutes or so, what do you find to be the most interesting thing about the documentary, The Battle Over Citizen Kane, and why? Note there is no right or wrong answer about this. I like to ask those kinds of questions, questions that ask you to think and questions that ask you to interpret. And if you were to read all of your classmate responses and my responses in turn, as I'm asking you to do, you should have a good sense of the class discussion that we would be having after watching these particular clips. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. Next class, we will specifically talk about Citizen Kane. Take care. Bye-bye.